I thought of doing a short video on using different CLI profiles when it comes to using the Rust AWS SDK. Now, different CLI profiles are helpful if you're especially working on a CLI tool that needs to work with different accounts or needs to assume different roles. The Rust AWS SDK documentation usually addresses the other majority use case where you'd usually work with a single set of credentials in a single process. So if you need to customize your code, it needs a little bit more work to go into the documentation, find out how to override the profile names, and then use that in the proper context. Before I dive into the content, hello. I make videos on AWS and general software engineering topics, and I release a video once every week. If that interests you, please consider subscribing. Right, back to the topic. So for this scenario, before writing the code, what I did was to go into the AWS config create documentation and then search for profile name. By the way, by doing this, I found that several methods that I used during the last video I made on the Rust AWS SDK have been made deprecated. So this includes load from environment method and also from environment method as well. So we'll use the alternatives when we start coding, but they're really easy to adapt if you just look at the documentation. So anyways, when looking at the documentation, we can find that there is a method available on the config loader struct to override the profile name. Now, if we just use what used to be load from environment method, that would return an SDK config struct, a already built configuration, but config loader struct represents the configuration loading process. So to access that struct, we need to use a different method. This used to be from environment, but we are going to use a newer method called defaults and then override the profile name. For this example, what I'm going to do is to try and list the S3 buckets using two different profile details. For the profiles, I'm just going to use the same credentials for the same account just because I don't have two accounts at the moment, but they can easily be credentials for different accounts or different roles. So first, I'm going to set up the profile details in the AWS CLI configuration files. Now the two files involved here are credentials and config. If you know about the AWS CLI, you know that config stores the general configuration that the CLI will need for different profiles, and credentials store the actual credentials again for different profiles. So for this, I'm going to use two profile names, test1 and test2, and what I'm going to do is to use the same credentials for these two profiles. And I'm also going to specify the default region to use for these two different profiles. Otherwise, I'll have to specify the region in the code. Right, now the profile configuration is set up. All we have to do is to start writing the code. Let's build a new cargo project and let's add the basic Rust AWS SDK crates that we need to use for this scenario. So for the first iteration, let's go in and write the code that will load the credentials from environment variables without considering any profiles, and then list the S3 buckets using those credentials. Now, a side note, we can see that load from environment has been made deprecated. Let's use the new method for this scenario. Okay, so let's run this in a shell with credentials as environment variables. Alright, so we know the code works, we know the credentials work, it can list the S3 buckets. Now it's time to modify the code so that it would take the list of profiles to use from, let's say, an environment variable, and then go through those profile names to use the credentials available for the different profiles. Let's load the profile names from an environment variable. I'm expecting the profile name list as a comma separated value, so I'm going to split them by commas and then iterate through the values to execute the same logic as before. So like I said earlier, we need the config loader struct instead of the SDK config one. So let's use a different method for that. So same as before, we can see that from environment has been deprecated. Let's use the new method. And let's run this in a shell without any credentials from the environment variables. And then let's specify the list of profile names for the program to use. So like we wrote the code, this is expected. We didn't specify the list of profile names. Let's do that. Alright, so as we can see, it goes through the list of profile names provided and then talks to the AWS API through the credentials specified in the profiles. I know that it's the same list of buckets, but for demo purposes, this is fine. You can easily switch this with different credentials for different accounts or different roles. Alright, so that was a brief video, pretty straightforward. Sorry for censoring a large chunk of the output. There's a lot of new development in this area about not leaking a lot of information, especially if you're worried about uncontrolled cloud costs. If you're interested in that topic, please check out the last video I did. Subscribe if you haven't already. But that's it for me. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week.